Hello guys and welcome back to Itchy Brains. Yup, that's right, back with another episode. I hope you guys are having a good day. Thumb up. It is past election week, and hopefully the candidate that we have chosen, or America has chosen, is going to work out best for this country. That's what I said in my previous episode before the president was chosen, and that's what I still hope to be true. I do have a story for this week. So, for those of you who don't know, I do a DoorDash as my part-time job. Basically, I delivered food to earn money. My boss is an app. It's a mobile app that I use, and then it just tells me, pick up from here, and then deliver it to this place. Yeah, it does feel like, sometimes it does feel like, oh shit, I'm living in a technological world. There is no boss kind of figure, like that always angry, never happy guy controlling me all the time, asking me to do this, do that. No, it's just a mobile phone telling me, hey, there's a food here. Do you want to get that? And then I'll be like, yeah, sure. And then I go to the place, they gave me the food, and then I deliver it to someone else. So I was doing that. I was doing my work. And then it asked me to go to an Indian restaurant. That's where I had to pick up the food from. So I walked in, and then there was a girl coming out of the kitchen. She saw me at the counter, and then she came out. And then as she was coming out, she said something in Nepali. And then I instantly recognized that she was a Nepali. And then she started asking me questions. She was like, hey, how can I help you? And I was like, and I said something to her in Nepali, giving her a clue that I was also a Nepali. And then we started chatting. And then yada, yada, yada. I found out how old she was. And then I found out, where she studies and that kind of stuff. Basically, my food, the food that I had to take out was delayed by like 10 minutes. So she was coming in and out of the kitchen, giving me comfort. Every once in a while, she went, oh, the food is about to be ready. Give me 2 more minutes. And I was like, yeah, no problem. And then as she was going back and forth, I started thinking, oh, I should try and ask this girl for a number. I've never done that before. I've never walked up to a random, stranger girl that I've only met for 8-9 minutes and then suddenly ask her for a number. That has never happened before. And I was like, oh, this is a good starting point. Let me ask her number. See how that goes. If I get rejected, I get rejected. I could care less. I didn't know you before, and then I would never know you again. That's fine. She wasn't like super attractive or something, but she was a good start for me. I would say that. Yeah, she was like a decent start for me. I was like, and also the fact that she was Nepali gave me enough confidence to talk to her in my own language and then ask her for a number. I don't know why that's a thing. So that was my first step. Nepali girl, and then I can walk my way up to, like white girl, and then Asian girl, and then girl from France or something. I don't know how the step works, but I will tell this though. Yeah. But yeah, the fact that she was Nepali did help a lot. If she was American, I don't think I would have dared to ask her a number. And then by that point, I'd gathered, 10 minutes. It was like, okay, right here, right now, just do it. Doesn't matter. Just ask her for a number. See how that goes. Get rejected. So I had the dial pad ready, and I was like, here. And then I was about to pass her my phone, and then she was like, 571. And I was like, okay, cool. And then I got her number, and that was that. So this episode is going to be a part 2 of the episode that I dropped last week. And today is a part 2 of that episode, but with a little bit of twist, in a sense that these are going to be more personalized, meaning that these are the podcasts that I don't see working for a whole lot of people, but the episode that I'm going to mention here are certainly worth a try, and they have worked for me for whatever reason. And it's a weird mix. There are some podcasts about high intellectual stuff, and then later down the list we get into the sex territory, and then there are like some sex podcasts that I want to talk about. So it's a weird mix. That's why I wanted to separate it into 2 episodes. This is again more personalized. This is something that has really worked for me, and all of the podcasts that are in the list are just absolutely brilliant in my point of view. And I would, yeah, just like previous episode, I would encourage you guys to check them all out, see what works for you, see what doesn't, and then make your way up from there. And just a counterpoint that I want to throw out there, if you guys haven't already downloaded Google Play, I will leave a link in the show notes where you can check out all the podcasts that I'm going to mention here. And just a little bit of guide there, telling you about how to go about this episode that you're listening to right now. Yeah, so don't forget to check the show notes. I think I would try to put in everything that I talk about here. In fact, this audio is an extra commentary on what's there down in the show notes. Okay, cool. Saying that, let's begin the list by talking about one of my first podcasts that I discovered somehow, and it's a weird on the list. I don't know how I discovered this podcast. The name of the podcast is called Making Sense, and I would put it in one of those brackets with intellectual podcast. The podcast is hosted by Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist and author of books like Waking Up, A Letter to a Christian Nation, Free Will. Sam has been particularly a critique of religion, and I feel like I fall in the same spectrum in the sense that I'm not been a huge fan of religion, so it's very easy for me to follow Harris. He's also known as the one of those guys that has formed new atheism. That's what people refer to it as. It's not atheism, but it's called new atheism. I wouldn't put myself in that bracket, but he's one of those people that are up there that are fighting against religion. And if you guys have any interest in spirituality, in politics, or other intellectual stuff, I would say Making Sense is a good place to get started. Now, be cautious here because Sam Harris has a monotone, meaning that he doesn't speak very fast. He takes his time, he breathes in some air once in a while. So the podcast can feel very slow, but then if you have listened to my previous podcast about how to consume more content, you just put it into X speed, and then you're good to go. I would say the best place to get started with Sam Harris is a conversation with Jordan Peterson. If you guys know who Jordan Peterson is, he's a famous Canadian psychologist. I believe he has returned back to whatever he was doing for YouTube, basically teaching. He's a professor at some Canadian university. He got very popular in the US for the courses that he had provided online on YouTube. He was sick for a while, but then I think he's back on YouTube again. Really interesting guy. He has a 2-part conversation with Sam Harris. It's a discussion. I wouldn't say it's very close to a debate, but they themselves say that it's not a debate. It's just Peterson and Sam Harris talking, and it's a brilliant, brilliant conversation. Again, I would say that it's very intellectual. I would say that the language they use are, they talk about truth, they talk about freedom, they talk about gods, they talk about mythology, they talk about stories, and how they come to work. So, and it's a very, very, very interesting podcast. On one side, you have Jordan Peterson talking about why that we shouldn't discard religion. And then on the other side, you have Sam Harris talking about why we should discard religion, why we should turn into facts and not stories. And I think it's a mind-blowing conversation. I would say that I only understood like 40 or 50% of the stuff that they were talking about, but still, it's a worthwhile conversation. I'll leave a link to those 2 YouTube videos in the show notes below. And then if you like that, you can check out Making Sense as well. That's the podcast from Sam Harris. Next on the list is a similar podcast that is, again, that falls, to me at least, that falls under very intellectual, big guys talking about big stuff. But the episode that I want to mention here is not like that. It's very different from any other podcast episode that I've ever heard, I've ever encountered. Right away, it just blew me out of my mind. The name of the podcast is called Portal. It's hosted by Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein is a mathematician / I would also put him in philosophical bracket. Also, I would put Sam Harris in the philosophical bracket. He's a philosopher of his own kind. Brilliant guy, knows a lot of stuff. knows how to think, knows how to act. And then in this episode that I'm going to mention, he talks with his son, Zev Weinstein. This Zev guy, he is a 14-year-old, and he's in his father's podcast. And the stuff that they talk about, it just, whew, the amount of knowledge that this kid, this 14-year-old kid has is, I think, what the level of knowledge that I'm going to have when I'm going to turn like 30 or 32. The learning curve is just vastly, vastly different. If you guys have heard about, small kids, like 12-year-old kid getting into MIT or something and then finishing his PhD, I would say Zev Weinstein is one of those guys, but then he's more lenient towards what's going on in the world right now. The question that Eric's asked Zev is just amazing, and the response that Zev has to those questions are just brilliant back and forth between a father and a child. The episode digs especially into Gen Z and what it means for the world. Who are Gen Z and how are they different from, say, the boomer generation or the silence generation? And one of the points that I still remember Zev talking about, I listened to the podcast like 4 or 5 months ago, but still some of this, one thing that stuck with me that Zev just put out, just like that, because he's such a smart guy. He just goes, the big companies are trying to figure out how to market to the Gen Z generation, and it's getting very hard for big companies to do that because we're not predictable. We're not as they think the boomer generation was. And I was like, oh my god, how do you know that stuff? You're only 14. Why do you care about that stuff? If you get in the vibe of the podcast, you realize that Zev has the intellectual capacity to challenge some of the notion that his father represents. And not in like, I'm going to win this argument like kids do with like nagging behavior. No, with like full rationality. And both, like the father is putting in his rationality and Zev, this kid, is putting in his rationality. And you can see Zev kind of weighs in on whatever his father is telling him. It's a brilliant conversation that every Gen Z kid, which I fall into that too. It's funny to say that sometimes, should listen to. I feel like it's one of the must. Just give this episode a listen and then form your own opinion. I'll leave the link in the show notes. Next up, we have Lex Friedman. I've talked about Lex before. My guy Lex. Lex has a podcast dedicated to AI, computation, space, aliens, love. I would be very careful starting out Lex Friedman's podcast. It's a very famous podcast, but the way Lex speaks is something that I can tell that is going to be bothering to some of the people because his voice is very monotonous. There isn't anything going on. You wouldn't hear any laughter. He's just like, he'll just tell you like extremely heavy stuff right under his breath. He'll be like, what is life? What am I doing here? Like, very monotonous. So, also, I don't think I've ever mentioned this, but he's a Russian kid. He recently put out an episode with Eric Weinstein, which is the guy who hosts The Portal, which is the podcast that I talked about before. I thought it was a brilliant conversation. Eric being a mathematician and Lex being a guy who claims that he's going to build the next Twitter, a better form of Twitter. Lex also knows how to code. And then sometimes he'll talk about starting a new Silicon Valley and that kind of stuff. And then it just makes the podcast more interesting. And I think the podcast with Eric Weinstein was absolutely brilliant. I enjoyed the shit out of it. Again, it's in the field of, you're not going to have like, oh, haha, kind of laughter in that podcast. But still, it's a good time if you follow rationality with which both of these guys are coming from. One of the points that I put down for Lex is he's an incredibly focused person. He says that he needs at least 4 to 6 hours of focus time alone every day. And I go, what? How does that not drive you mad? He'll do like weird stuff when a podcast is starting. I noticed in one of the episodes, he would just put out his phone and then start a timer. And then one of the guests asked him, why are you taking it out of your phone? Why are you starting a timer? And then he just went, Oh, I just want to see how much fun I'm having. Like that. He uses a fucking timer to see how much fun he's having. He needs to know how much time is passing by, whether or not he's noticing the time that is passing by. And if it doesn't, he's having fun. But if it does, he's not having fun. It's like everything is so precisely calculated. But he's a cool guy. I like his podcast. And to get started, I would recommend the episode with Eric Weinstein. It will give you a taste of what both of these men feel like and what both of their podcasts sound like. It's a very interesting conversation, and one that I can certainly fall behind. Every piece that they talk about, I feel like I can relate to that. The next podcast on the list is more focused on masculinity, and it's tip-based podcast, meaning it's a podcast for guys. There are topics like how should a man dress up? How should a man change if they want to change? How should they promote something like exercising in their life? How should they grow a beard? And all these kind of topic, all these fun topic that just teaches us how to be better men at the end of the day. I would say that most of the audience targeted for this podcast are young men like me who are probably in their early 20s to somewhere in their late 40s. That's I think the targeted audience. After that, I don't think it resonates any better. They also have a website that I think is awesome. It just gives you tips about what men look like in the 1800s when they have the big fuck off mustache, and then just like casual things like, okay, how do you dress up for a date? If you want to know more about, say, Jiu-Jitsu or karate and those kind of stuff, I recommend you check out this episode on Jiu-Jitsu that they did. And I think that's a good episode to begin with. Now, let's get into one of the most popular territories in the podcasting world, which is sex-based podcast. I remember being very confused when I first discovered sex podcast. I didn't know what to do with them, but then slowly as I listened to more and more episodes, I was like, this is really helpful stuff. These are the stuff that I don't really get to hear about. And I was very unlikely at that time to pick up a book and read about sex and what it meant for women and what it means for me, and then having a deeper understanding of that. So at the beginning it was weird, but then slowly and but surely I got to respect the genre enough. And I can see why this is a popular genre. Obviously, in the podcasting world, comedy and I think it's sex that are very popular. Especially sex podcasts that are hosted by females. And then most of the sex podcasts that are out there are, I think, female oriented, meaning that most of the targeted audience are females. But then I listen to it anyways. They're fun. Okay, I admit they're fun. So the first podcast on this territory I have is known as Sex with Emily. I'll tell you what, if you notice like all the titles that I have for all these sex podcasts, you'll notice like a similar pattern, which is they're insanely intimate. Like this one, Sex with Emily. I was like, oh my god, like what kind of title is that? Sex with Emily is hosted by Dr. Emily. I don't know what her last name is, but then she's a sexologist or something like that. And then she basically knows all the things about sex. And then, like I said, it's more like a therapeutic podcast. It's more like if you want to know more about sex from a doctor or from a specialist, this is where you go to. This is not where you go to if you want to hear like freaky stories about sex. No. It's like you hear questions like, how do I make my girlfriend orgasm? How do I orgasm in the first place? What is a clitoris? What is a G-spot? But what's the role of a lube? I've heard like a decent amount of episode, probably like 5 or 6, and then I basically got the gist of the whole podcast. I can tell you some of the main points that you are gonna hear if you give this podcast a shot, which I think you should. You're gonna know more about sex. Emily goes, both ways. She prioritizes female, and then she'll come back to male as well, which is, plus. So here are the main points that you're going to hear if you listen to any of the episodes from Sex with Emily. Number 1, use lube. Lube is very important. Use lube. That just got embedded in my head as soon as I started listening to the podcast. Number 2, A clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings, whereas a penis only has 4,000. The little sailor in the boat, that little guy in the vulva, also it's a vulva, not a vagina. That's also something I learned. I don't know if it was from a book or from the podcast, but anyways. So that little guy, which is known as clitoris, has more nerve endings than a penis has. And then number 3, foreplay is really fucking important. Just give the podcast a listen. I don't think you're gonna leave the podcast without getting these ideas stamped into your head. And also, like I said, you'll get a better understanding of how orgasm works for women and stuff. Talking about sex, I feel like I need to have some sex. It's been a long time. All right, the second up on the list for sex podcast, it's called Girls on Porn. You see what I meant when I was talking about the titles? It just sounds incredibly sexy. Girls on Porn. It sounds like freshman college girls starting a podcast on sex, but it's not that. I believe these are women in their late 20s or something like that. And then they review porn, and then they talk about specific topic in each episode. Some of the episodes also have very specific topics, so it's divided. So for the first half of the podcast, you'll hear a topic on like orgasm or double penetration or fingering or whatever. And then on the other half of the podcast, they'll review porn. And I thought, what a strange idea, but it works. It works so well. Girls talking about porn, and then they review the porn that they like. The podcast is also a good resource to discover good porn. It's a plus. You get to hear 2 girls talking about sex, and then you're getting a review on porn, which you can check out later if if it sounds interesting to you. I'll be honest, sometimes when I'm listening to this podcast, which I don't do often right now, I feel like I got the gist of the podcast, and then I'm out of that phase. But once in a while, I'll see some interesting topics like public sex, and then I'll be like, oh, I want to hear about that. Tell me some stories about that. So I'll chime in. But other than that, I'm out of that phase. I gave the podcast a shot, and I can tell that it's a like wild, freaky podcast. Sometimes I do wonder if the whole podcast was oriented for females, and I go, what am I doing listening to this podcast? And then later on, I'll just be like, who cares? It's very, I think it sounds like absolutely sexy. I don't come from a society where women talk about sex or porn. So yes, it's absolutely sexy to me to know that side of porn. And for that reason, I think it's a beautiful podcast. And if you guys want to get started, I would recommend the recent episode that I checked out. It's called Fingering. Like I said, first half is covered for fingering and how that works. And then the second half is a porn review that like they just watch loads and loads of porn, and then they only talk about one interesting porn that they found. Again, links in the show notes. Check out for yourself, especially if you're a girl. Next up on the list, it's not a sex podcast, but then it's a really interesting episode dedicated for a sex surrogate. The name of the podcast is Curious Kamal. The podcast is hosted by Kamal Ravikant, who is also an author of this book called Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. It's a really wonderful book, easy, simple read. Kamal brings in, it was absolutely a new term that I heard from this podcast. And I think when I talk about sex doesn't necessarily have a positive reputation right away. But once you start diving into these podcasts, you'll see what I mean. These people make sex like a positive thing, not something that, we should be afraid of, or a taboo that, no one should talk about. Having someone else talk to you about sex in a extremely positive manner, there is a beauty in that I don't think you can get in any other medium. Anyways, Kamal brings in a guest who is a sex surrogate. Now, what is a sex surrogate, you might ask? I didn't know what that was either. Basically, a sex surrogate is a person, in this case, it's a woman, who sleeps with other men as a therapy. Boom. blown my mind. I'm interested. I want to listen to the whole podcast. A woman, us, a person that looks out for people who are depressed, who need help, and then she fixes that through this practice known as sex. Now, an assumption can be made about whether she is a prostitute or not. And I think she says that that's a common misunderstanding that people have. But no, she's not a prostitute. She's a therapist that uses sex as a medicine. It is a beautiful way to talk about sex in a positive fashion. And the story that the girl tells about when she was a girl is, I think, was one of those stories that just brilliant right off the bat. The trauma that she had to go through, the way she had to be raised in an orphanage. It's a really fun talk. They don't shy away from anything. They'll talk how the process works A to Z. One of the one of the interesting things that I really took home from this episode was this story that the guest told, the sex surrogate told. Basically, there was an 80-year-old man who was suffering from erectile dysfunction, and then he was really depressed that his penis, could never be erect anymore. And then he had basically tried all the pills, all those stuff that doctor gave him, and then nothing worked for him. So the guest of the podcast finds that old man, and then she basically sleeps with him. And then by the end, the guy is able to have an erection and then have an orgasm. And I just thought, wow, that is absolutely magical. That's a work that someone does. It's a work that pays someone bill. And I just love the podcast from the start to finish. And I would recommend you guys check out the podcast as well. It's not a sex podcast entirely. There are other topics that Kamal covers, but I would say this is my favorite podcast by far from Kamal. Let's dive into comedy. Comedy is a genre that I absolutely love in the podcasting world. And the podcast that I'm going to mention, I wouldn't say it's going to work for a whole lot of people, but it's called Flagrant 2. It's absolutely unapologetic on the takes that they do. There's a white guy. There are two white guys, one African guy, one Indian guy, and then it's just like a mixture of all these cultures, and then they come together and then they roast the shit out of each other sometimes. I think this podcast is my main source of news. They basically talk about the things that are happening right now. If they release an episode today, that episode won't be as relevant like 2 or 3 months from now. I would say like 2 weeks later, the episode just dies. It's not timeless or anything. It just you listen to it like fresh and then it just dies right away. Incredibly funny. It's hosted by Andrew Schultz. Andrew Schultz has worked his way up to be one of my favorite stand-up comedians working right now. He doesn't have a Netflix special yet, but I would love for him to have a Netflix special at some point. This guy does something called crowd work. Basically, he roasts people right on the spot with jokes that he's not prepared with. Most of the stand-ups that you see will have, like a material that they have already prepared. But this guy does jokes right off the bat, right on the stage. The people he sees, just goes at him. And it's just like incredible the way the whole podcast has functioned. It's a very New York style comedy. And then there's a host who is an Indian. So there's something that I can relate to. And then sometimes they just go at each other. Sometimes they get salty at each other. And then those are just like my favorite episodes. Again, links in the show notes. Next up on the list is one of those podcasts. One of the podcasts that I listen to the most. It's called Views. It's hosted by David Dobrik and Jason Nash. It just cracks me up every single time. If I'm driving, I just have to stop my car to get that laughter out of me. No, I'm just kidding. I've never done that, but it's a joyride. Every time I listen to the podcast, I usually pick the podcast up whenever I'm going for a drive somewhere far, and then it's like it just makes the whole car ride so much better. Now, here's the catch. In order to get the better out of the podcast, if you guys want to give it a try, You need to know who these guys are. David Dobrik is, I would say, one of those guys that I, for some reason, look up to. Like, there's so much that I can learn from David Dobrik. For people who don't know David Dobrik, he's a content creator. He's a YouTuber with a huge following. And I would say he has the best vlogs on YouTube right now. I love his blogs. I love the blogs so much that I had to unsubscribe from him so that I wouldn't watch the vlogs anymore. I was just getting super addicted to the vlogs. But yeah, I still listen to the podcast. The guy is filthy rich, and it's, sometimes it's fun to, take a snippet of what it's like to have a rich life, like the guy. Obviously, he doesn't flex or anything, but just the way he talks. Both of them are incredibly funny. And I don't think I can go about the podcast without mentioning Jason Nash. So David vlogs are like what Friends was in the 90s is what David blog is in the YouTube world. They're basically Friends in the modern era. And Jason Nash has a huge role to play in that. I think Jason Nash is the funniest member in the Vlog Squad, and I absolutely love that guy. Just love him. Check out the podcast. Check out David's YouTube channel if you haven't already, which is not something I should say, really. Next up on the list, I have honorable mention, and on the honorable mention, I have Joe Rogan. If you guys don't know who Papa Rogan is, he's the go-to of the podcast industry right now. Basically, the giant man himself, Papa Rogan, who basically is at the top of the ladder right now. I don't think I should say who Papa Rogan is. Obviously, putting him in honorable mention category is a joke. For this podcast, I would highly recommend checking out an episode with David Cho and listening to that episode. It's a wild ride. You'll get to see what a life of a depressed person looks like. And I think this is the best podcast that Joe Rogan is going to put out the whole year. I can guarantee that. I just love that episode so much. I can't wait to re-listen to it again. David Cho is that guy who went on the jungle of Congo to search for a dinosaur and then almost got lost and died in that jungle. He shares that story in the episode. And then, like, all these stories that David Cho mentions throughout the podcast is just incredible. The way this guy talks, the way this guy is able to dictate a story, the way this guy is able to narrate his whole fucking life, it's just absolutely brilliant. I would say this, though, the podcast is long. It's almost like 4.5 hours, right? But it's well worth it. I didn't mind any single minute of the podcast. I just absolutely enjoyed it. Next up on the list, I have a Nepali podcast. I had to get some kind of Nepali podcast in, and I'm glad that I found this podcast. It only has 4 episodes, but if anything, I would say there should be more podcasts like this that this guy is putting out. I don't think it's a well-known podcast in the field right now, but it's an incredible listen from this guy. I forgot his name, but his last name is Subba. I've listened to 1 episode, and then that 1 episode was enough for me to get hooked. That episode was kind of like a review plus extra commentary on the book Sapiens. And then once I finished listening to that episode, I emailed that guy. I was like, hey, thank you for putting out this podcast. I think it's absolutely incredible. And then he doesn't put out any more episodes. And then so I was like, do you mind putting out some more episodes? Because I think this podcast is just fantastic. And I feel like more Nepali people need to hear what a good quality podcast sounds like. So I sent him that email, and then 2 or 3 days later, he sent a reply back. And then he was like, yeah, thank you, man. Like, you're the first person to reach out to me. And then he said, basically, it just takes like loads and loads of time to create a podcast, and it's not feasible anymore. So yeah, I gotta give my man a shout out, Suba Podcast, for all the Nepali people out there. Highly recommend. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Yeah, guys, enjoy your rest of the day. Check out all of these podcasts that I mentioned here. All of them are absolutely brilliant. If anything, if you don't think any of them sound interesting, that's fault on my part for not being able to articulate them well, for not being able to tell how good these podcasts are. And if you find any podcast that you enjoy, you can tell me about it on Instagram. My Instagram is @project33. You can text me there. You can say hi, anything, whatever. Just want to talk about your day or something. You can meet me there. I have a host. If you guys didn't know, he's from Australia. His name is Pragyan. He's full of shit. I don't know when I'm going to see him next on the podcast. But yeah, he's full of shit. Yeah, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Check these podcasts out. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.